So, my name's Suzy Moat. I'm an Associate Professor of Behavioural Science at Warwick Business School. And I'm actually also now a Faculty Fellow of the Alan Turing Institute here in London. So, my background's a mixture of both psychology and computer science. And for many years, people used to come to me and say, Suzy, that's a really strange combination. But I think one of the reasons we're all here today is that things have really changed over the past few years. And increasingly, everything that we're doing is generating data. So, as Sophie said, at Warwick, I have the huge honour of directing the Data Science Lab alongside my colleague Tobias Price. And in the Data Science Lab, we're particularly interested in data from the internet. So you can think of the kind of data that we're all generating by taking photographs and uploading them to the internet, or perhaps by playing games, or by just looking for information on Google. And one of the things we want to try and understand is whether this data can help us measure human behaviour that was previously just too time-consuming, too expensive, or actually impossible to measure. So let me give you an example. Consider this map. This is a map that was created just by plotting the locations in which 32 million photographs were taken over the period of a year before they were uploaded to the service Flickr. Now, if you look at this map, you can obviously see a lot of data there on where Flickr users are. But if Flickr users are taking photographs as they move around on holiday, for example, we might also have some insights into how they're moving around the world. Now, like many things in social science, trying to measure this behaviour has traditionally been really expensive and really time-consuming. So if any of you have flown in and out of UK airports often enough, you might have at some point been approached by somebody with a clipboard who wanted to know where you'd spent the last 12 months. And this question is part of the International Passenger Survey. So it's a survey that the Office for National Statistics carries out to try and understand where visitors to the UK are from. So Tobias and I, we were looking at this map with our colleagues Daniele Barchiesi, Christian Ellis and Stephen Bishop. And we were wondering, might we be able to work out where these visitors are coming from without the clipboards? So what we did is we found people who'd taken photographs in the UK, and we looked at where they'd taken photographs over the past 12 months. And we made a huge simplification. So if we found that somebody had taken a photograph in one country, like Germany, then we assumed that they'd stayed there until we saw them take a photograph somewhere else, like France. And even with this massive simplification, you find that you can actually come up with excellent estimates of where visitors coming to the UK are from that match up well with the data that's otherwise collected by the Office for National Statistics. Now, if you dig further into this, what you'll see is that it's otherwise so expensive to carry out this survey that the Office for National Statistics generally only speak to about 40,000 people per year. Whereas we can actually survey with Flickr data 15,000 people a year for free. So that gives you some sort of initial idea of how these data sets might be able to massively reduce the cost of measuring human behaviour at a global scale. As excited as we were about this, you could argue that we'd possibly left out some of the most interesting information in the Flickr dataset, which is the photographs themselves. So this is a photograph of the Lake District. Now, I absolutely love the Lake District. I grew up near there, and I used to really enjoy spending time there because it was beautiful, and being in this really beautiful place would make me feel better. Now, up in the corner there, that's Chinuki Sarasinya. Chinuki is a doctoral researcher who Tobias and I are really lucky to work with at Warwick. And before Chinuki came to Warwick, she had a very long and interesting career doing things including running her own design studio. And so Chinuki has a real sense of the potential impact of the way things look. So Chinuki, Tobias and I, we were looking at pictures like this, and we were wondering, is there not some way that we could use this huge volume of online photographic information to try and quantify the relationship between how a place looks and how healthy people feel? Now, the cold hard truth is that most of us don't actually spend all of our time on holiday. And so potentially the more important question is how the way in which a place we live in impacts our health. Now, thanks to the Office for National Statistics, we do have quite a lot of information on how healthy people are, which is classified by where they live. So there's a question on the census that asks people to report how good they consider their health to be. And you can pick everything from very bad to very good. And you can imagine, unfortunately, older people tend to say that their health is worse. And so we have to normalise this data for both age and actually gender. But once we've done that, we can map it. And it looks something like this. So lighter areas are areas where people reported their health to be worse. And if you look at this map, you can see quite quickly that big cities such as London or Manchester are coming out as areas where people have reported their health to be worse. So we've got this health data, but the big question is, how are we going to actually measure how attractive these areas at that same sort of national scale? And the answer to this question thankfully came to us in the shape of a game called Scenic or Not. So Scenic or Not is a game that was made by an organisation called My Society back in 2009. And Scenic or Not shows you photographs like this and asks you to rate them depending on how scenic you think they are. So if you think this is a very scenic photograph, you can pick 10. If you think it's not very scenic, you can pick 1, or you can choose a score in between. And at the same time, the photographs that you see on Scenic or Not are from another game which is called Geograph. And in Geograph, people get points by uploading photographs taken in as many kilometre squares of the UK as possible. So using Scenic or Not, we've got over 1.5 million ratings of how attractive over 200,000 locations are across the UK. So if you plot that for England, it looks like this. So on this map, areas that are shown in dark purple are the areas that people thought were more scenic. So up in the north, you can see the Lake District, basically everyone agreeing with me. But down in the south, you see Cornwall comes out as well. On the other hand, you can see that cities such as London have not done so well. So what we wondered is, what would happen if we put these two data sets together? And what you find is that people who live in more scenic locations report their health to be better. Now, if you've just been looking at those last two maps, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, is that not insanely trivial? You know, we've seen that cities are not rated as very scenic, and at the same time, there are also areas where people have reported their health to not be as good. So is this just about whether people live in the city or the country? So we wondered this too. So we split England into urban areas, suburban areas, and rural areas. And what you find is that even if you just consider urban areas on their own, people who live in areas that have been rated as more scenic still report their health to be better. And the same holds just within suburban areas and just within rural areas. So that's one possible explanation, but you might think, well, you know, there's other obvious potential stories behind this. You know, maybe it's about money. Arguably, people who've got less money are going to have less resources that they can put towards trying to look after their health. And they're also not going to have the resources to call on to choose to live in more attractive locations. So again, we wondered this too, and thankfully there's a lot of data on socioeconomic characteristics and measures of deprivation such as this. And if you put this sort of data into the model, then you find that while measures such as income deprivation are, unfortunately, related to measures of health, it's still not enough to explain this relationship. A final thing you might wonder, looking at that picture, is that, the Lake District is obviously a very beautiful place, but it's also fairly undeniably very green. So do people maybe just enjoy and feel better when they spend time in greener locations? And we've just found a really complicated way of measuring how green places are. Now, thankfully, it has been possible to measure how green different places are for a long time. You can take an aerial photograph of an area, and you can work out how much of the place is covered with green space. And if you plot that data, it looks like this. So, up towards the north, you see, yes, the Lake District's very green, we knew that. But if you compare this to the map of scenicness, you see that while there are some similarities, these measures are not exactly the same. Specifically, there are some areas that you'll see on the left are scoring as quite green, but on the right are not coming out as very scenic. And what you find the statistics tell you is that if you really want to understand differences in how healthy people report themselves to be, you can't afford to throw out this scenicness data. In fact, this analysis suggests that if you look at just the urban areas, the most convincing model actually just looks at the measure of how aesthetically attractive an area is and doesn't consider the green space data. So this is just a first piece of evidence that suggests that living in an aesthetically attractive environment might not just be a nice to have. It might actually impact on something which is important to us, as our health. And while this is very much just the beginning of a research programme, not the end, we're really excited about the possibilities that exist to run further analyses to try and get more insight into this fascinating relationship. However, there have been occasions when we thought that online data could help us understand people's behaviour and indeed how healthy they are. And then it's turned out that the measurements that have come through have actually been drastically wrong. So, consider the case of Google flu trends. So I'm sure everybody in this room has probably had the flu at one point or other. It's not a very pleasant experience, to say the least. But most of us suffer for a few days and then eventually we get over it. Unfortunately, that's not the case for everybody. There are some more vulnerable people who can be put into hospital by flu, and for whom it can even lead to death. And so this is one of the reasons that doctors are very keen to try and keep tabs on how many people have the flu, so that they can be aware of a situation getting bad before it gets very dramatic. Now, the challenge here is that actually doctors don't normally have information on how many people have the flu right now. They only know how many people had the flu a week or a couple of weeks ago. And the reason for that is the way in which this data is normally collected. So normally what happens is that somebody realises they've got the flu, they go to the doctor, they say, I've got the flu, the doctor makes a note, that person had the flu, and then eventually this is collated on a national scale. And all of this still takes a while. So some engineers at Google were looking at this, and they said, well, I think we've got an opportunity to help here. Because if people have got the flu, they might not just go to the doctor to report that. They might start Googling, for example, their symptoms online. And Google has data on what people are looking for straight away. So these engineers went away and they tried to find words and phrases that people were searching for a lot when flu levels were high and not very much when flu levels were low. And they succeeded, and they found a group of terms that matched this pattern. And they found that if they tracked search behaviour in the future for these search terms, that they could actually work out how many people had the flu before the doctors did. So if you consider this diagram, you can see Google's estimate in black and the doctor's estimate in red. You can see that the Google dot is pretty much is always in front of the doctor's dot, and that Google's estimate is generally pretty good. And so this all looked fantastic and, incredibly useful until this happened. So in the winter of 2012-2013, Google put out an estimate where they said that they thought that over 10% of the US population was currently suffering from the flu. And when the actual data came through, it turned out it was actually closer to 6%. So they'd been miles off. So what on earth went wrong? Well, one of the key explanations that have been put out there is that winter there was a flu scare. So there was loads of coverage of the flu in the newspapers and in the media. And so people started worrying about the flu and started Googling for those words that the Google engineers had found before and were using as an indicator of people actually having the flu. And so this meant that Google's indicator rocketed and everything fell over. Now, this led to all sorts of headlines, saying big data, it's all hype, we knew this had been overspun, it's a lot of rubbish, and we should go back to the traditional way of doing things. And so Tobias and I, we were looking at this data and this problem, and we wondered, is this really the case? Is there really no value in this data set? Or is there something that could have been done differently? Now, if you look at this diagram, you'll see that there were actually a few early warning signs that something was wrong before the famous peak in the winter of 2012 and 2013. So Google's estimates on this diagram are in red, and the official data is in blue. And you can see that for quite a long time before the peak, the red estimate is above the blue estimate. And actually what had happened was that Google's engineers had worked out the relationship between how often people were searching for these terms and how many people had the flu quite a bit earlier. But then they'd assumed that this relationship would stay the same. So there was this implicit assumption in the model that the relationship between how often people were Googling for these terms and how many people had the flu was actually the same. So you could obviously do that differently. You could consider every time you receive a new data point from the doctor, well, how does the recent data from the doctors correspond to the recent data on what people have been searching for? And you could use that to calibrate your model. A second thing that you could potentially do to improve this is to consider the data from the doctors too. So what Google originally did was base their estimates just on what people have been searching for. We know that the doctor's data was taking a while to come through, but arguably, how many people had the flu a couple of weeks ago is probably going to give us some indication of how many people have got the flu right now. So you could build that into your model as well. And it turns out that if you do both of those things, using data from Google Flu Trends does indeed allow you to improve estimates of how many people have got the flu right now. So, we convinced ourselves it wasn't actually the data that was the problem here, it was the methods. And that throwing out that data would have been a real case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But it does underscore the importance of using and indeed developing appropriate methods for interpreting patterns in these new data sets appropriately. summarise, I've given you examples of how we can use data on photographs people upload to the internet, data from games that people are playing, data on what people are searching for online, to help us understand where people are, how they move around, how healthy they are, and indeed what might be affecting their health. And those are just a few examples of the results we've been finding in our data science lab that suggest that data from the internet might help us measure human behaviour that was previously too expensive, too time-consuming, or possibly even impossible to measure. Thank you very much.